Welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing an episode of Chris Talks Tech. This is where we kind of go over some tech news, camera stuff, whatever it is. Today is actually going to be the ZV-1 Mark II because this camera has caused a lot of controversy, and I just want to go over it. As somebody who loved the original ZV-1, I have some very contrasting thoughts to what looks like the general consensus about this new camera. Now, before we go on, I do not have a ZV-1 Mark II with me. I have not touched it, but I've watched pretty much every review online, and I've actually, spoiler alert, decided to pre-order it. I'm very familiar with the original ZV-1. I've owned it. I made tons of vlogs, which are actually some of my favorite ones, so I think I'm qualified to talk about this camera. When it comes to this release, this is probably one of the most controversial Sony releases in a long time. We've been accustomed to Sony kind of leading the industry, having the most ridiculous features in the smallest cameras. Look at the Sony ZV-1, the full frame ZV-1. And I just think with this release, it's very reflective of where we are as a society in 2023. We expect everything to be the best, most breakthrough thing every single time. And to be fair, for the most part, we've been given that, so I get why people are like that. But when it comes to the ZV-1 Mark II, I want to talk about the original one and what was actually wrong with it, because that is going to shape a lot of what I think the ZV-1 Mark II is for and why people are completely losing their minds over this. The general consensus about the ZV-1 was it's the almost perfect vlogging cameras, except for a few minor things that need to be adjusted. One was the lack of a touchscreen. You could only use it for focus tracking. You couldn't actually navigate with it. Two, the menus were atrociously bad and really hard to navigate through. The third thing, and probably the most important, was the lens itself was not wide enough. The fourth thing, the quarter 20 mount was too close to the battery door, so when you mounted a tripod or a plate onto it, it blocked the access to the media and the battery. Therefore, you had to unscrew that thing every single time you wanted to use it, which is insanely frustrating because the battery life is not that great on these compact cameras to begin with. And number 5, it charged with micro USB, which is obviously not favorable over USB-C in 2023. Those are the things that ZV-1 owners wanted improvements on for the next generation camera. Now let's talk about some of the stupid complaints that I keep hearing about this release. Kind of from people clearly who never used the original camera. No 4K 60. Whatever, I get it. It would be nice to have 4K 60. If you want 4K 60, you're going to need to buy a real camera. And by real, I mean a bigger camera that has better heat sinks, that has bigger sensors, everything like that. Just get a bigger camera. 4K 60, obviously, if they could put it in there, I'd want it, but it's not a requirement. No lens iOS, so no image stabilization in the lens. If you'd used the original ZV-1, you would know that OIS was pretty much unusable. It didn't really do anything. And so when you wanted to have the stabilization, you needed to use the active stabilization mode, which cropped in atrociously on the 24mm, basically making it unusable for vlogging. And that brings me to the third complaint, which is that the lens still is not wide enough. And while I agree, I would love a wider lens, maybe a 15 or a 16mm equivalent, when it comes to a 1-inch sensor, it's very hard to make a lens that is that equivalent view angle. For instance, the ZV-1 Mark I has a 24mm equivalent lens. In order to get that, the lens itself actually has to be a 9.4mm lens. So in order to get a field of view of 24mm that we're used to seeing on a full frame camera, the lens on the ZV-1 would need to be 9.4mm. That's a pretty wide lens. Now with the new Sony ZV-1 Mark II, we have an 18mm equivalent lens. That makes the actual lens that they put onto this thing a 6.9mm lens. That is extremely wide, and they did it in the same body with the same aperture. So it still has a 1.8 aperture at that wide of a lens. Now I won't get into the differences between what a 1.8 looks like on a full frame versus that. It doesn't really matter, but what I'm saying is that the actual optical lens in there needs to be way wider on a smaller sensor, which is a engineering feat in itself. I mean, Fujifilm just released an 8mm 3.5 lens for the Fuji system, and I believe that lens is about $799 USD, which is actually quite affordable for what you're getting. Of course, with the lens construction, they're going to need to kind of look at it and say, what can we remove from this? Putting OIS in that lens would probably not be possible at that wide range, as well as it didn't really do much in the original ZV-1. So for me to even begin to make a difference, I think it would need in-body image stabilization, where the sensor's actually moving. But then again, you look at all these wobbles that you're getting from the Canons and all these other cameras, and that's because of how wide the lens is, and there's not a lot of room to work with here. So my main point here is that they actually had to engineer a brand new lens with quite a ridiculous constraint on what they could and couldn't do as far as keeping the body the same size and keeping the aperture the same size. It's a brand new lens. They made this lens for this camera. The old 24-70 that we're used to on the ZV-1 was actually just the RX100 lens transplanted into the newer body. So for the people who actually used the ZV-1 and had all the complaints about the original one, here's what the Mark II actually updated. And I'm just going to read this here because I don't want to ramble on too much. New touchscreen, new menus, wider lens, moving the 1/4-20 mount to the side so you can access the battery door with a tripod or a tripod mount. They actually improved the audio. No one asked for that, but that's always a welcomed thing. It's got USB-C charging with power delivery, so you don't need to use a dummy battery if you want to just plug it in as a webcam. And yes, they removed the OIS, but honestly, I believe it was useless anyway. The ZV-1 Mark II is actually, I think, what the original ZV-1 should have been. So for everyone who's complaining about this camera, I would really encourage you to look at what the complaints were about the original ZV-1 and the changes that Sony actually made. It seems to me that Sony actually took everyone's complaints from the original version and just corrected it and made the new one so that people who had the original one would be happy with the changes. Now, you can work around a lot of these changes with the old one and kind of Frankenstein your ZV-1 to be a lot of what the new one is, but that comes with basically ruining everything which makes this camera so great, which is its form factor. People literally Frankenstein this camera to be basically what the Mark II is out of the box. So if you wanted the 1/4-20 thread moved on your original ZV-1, you'd have to get a cage, which bulked it up. That would add more mounting points to it. If you wanted a wider lens, you had to get this attachment from Ulanzi to put onto the front, which ends up making it an 18, but ironically, if you leave it on there, it's about an 18-50 because you're now widening the long end too, so you're not really gaining anything there. You'd have to unscrew it to get the 70mm back, but the clear image zoom is so good that on the new one with the 18-50, you still get about an 18-75. Yes, it's one stop lower, but that's what you get when you want to have a wider lens. I know initially when I was watching these reviews, I thought, yeah, this is kind of underwhelming, and I kind of bought into the hype that this wasn't a massive upgrade on the original, but then I thought about when I owned the original, what were the things I said I wanted to be improved? And they actually improved pretty much all of those things. So I figured as a user of the Sony ZV-1, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and actually try out this new one. I might be wrong in the long run, but I think that this camera will be one of the ones that surprises people, kind of like the EOS R when it came out. Underwhelming specs, but actually everything you need. I have a feeling it's going to be a very popular camera despite all of the talking heads saying how they wish it had all of these bigger specs. And like I said before, if you want all of these pro specs, then use a bigger camera. I'm using my XH2S right now to film this video because that's the camera that I have to use. I still have that if I have the ZV-1, but I don't really want to carry this every single day with me like I would the ZV-1 Mark II. The best camera to tell stories is the one that gets the shot. And sometimes that might be your phone, sometimes that might be another camera. But I can almost guarantee you that 90% of the time it's not going to be your big mirrorless setup. So that's it. That's my rant for today. That's my rebuttal to all of these negative reviews on the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. I can't wait to finally get it. It looks like it's shipping out on June 8th, which I find to be a little bit misleading because B&H says June 15th, but that doesn't matter. Once I get it, I will be making an actual review of the camera. Let me know your thoughts below. I'm looking forward to reading all of your hate comments and opinions. But yeah, as my friend Taka would say, happy shooting. Peace.